All right, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a really nice lunch, and thank you very much for attending the conference. So it is my pleasure to introduce Amy Lockwood. She is currently the Chief of Staff to the Global Health Sciences Director of Research at UC San Francisco. Amy has a bachelor's degree in communication studies and a master's in marketing communications from Northwestern University, and she has an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. She has extensive experience in business development and global health implementation. Amy was the Deputy Director of the Stanford University Center for Innovation in Global Health, and she also was the Executive Director of Project Healthy Children. In addition to this, she was the director of the Global Pediatric HIV/AIDS Program and India Deputy Country Director for the Clinton Foundation. She also works as a strategic business consultant for Lippincott Mercer, which is now Oliver Wyman, and she is currently a consultant and advisor to several global health-focused businesses and enterprises. And please enjoy Amy's talk. Thank you.
I think what that introduction proves is that I just can't hold down one job for very long, or that I'm very, very old. I'll go with the former. I have actually changed jobs quite a bit. I started, just to give you a little bit more context, I started my career focusing on marketing. I did a whole slew of degrees on communication because I thought it was really interesting how you could use different tools to manipulate people. And manipulate is sort of the bad business term for it. The good is behavior change. After a little bit of a career in that, I realized that it was the dark side, and I was making people do things that I didn't think was very good for them to do, but that I had a set of skills that would be useful if I turned them towards the light, and so I took a job focusing on global health. I will assume that all of you agree that that is a turn for the better since you're working on the same issues today. But when I first came into global health, the reason I did it is that I looked at some problems that were happening in the world and they just made me angry. The one that got me at first was HIV in Africa. And as a newly minted MBA, are there any B school folks here? They all left after lunch. So I can say this, and I would have said it in front of them anyway, but I'll say it now and you'll laugh. As a newly minted MBA, I thought I was fully prepared to change the world. And when I saw that there was a problem of HIV in Africa, I figured they must not have a business school student working on it. And if I only went for a few weeks, I could probably figure it out. I'm really not kidding. I had that kind of thought process, that this was such a big problem and we had found a way to basically make HIV a disease that was manageable here in the US. What on earth was the problem that we couldn't figure it out in Africa? If I had some of the backgrounds that you do, I probably would have gone to the lab and tried to create something that would have been a product that would have solved it, but I didn't have those skills. I was a business person, and so I thought it was much more about processes and about managing people, about understanding what the customers needed, understanding how the business cycle worked, understanding how inventory management worked. And so I got a job at the Clinton Foundation because that's the kind of thing that we do at the Clinton Foundation. And I learned very quickly that a new MBA was not the person who was going to solve HIV in Africa. It was a much more complicated problem than that. And I was slapped in the face by a lot of the realities because I actually spent the time going on the ground and listening to people. So my talk today isn't technical. My talk today is basically the extension of that experience that I had, thinking that there was a problem that I could solve because I had a certain set of skills and understood things from one perspective, and then how that translated when I actually went to the field and saw what the problem looked like on the ground with the people who were having it, and the difference between the two. Because it turns out that as I look across all of the different groups that I've seen working on trying to solve these problems, both technically and from a process perspective, we continue to face the same problem. It's really hard when we sit here in beautiful Berkeley to really understand the depths of the problems that are happening in the real world out there that we want to fix. Well, maybe it's not understanding them, but really understanding the scope, understanding what's happening across the entire value chain, what are the motivations, what are the different kinds of complications that we have to think about in order to make the solutions that we come up with something that has the impact that we dreamed that it would have. So when I was at Stanford, I had the opportunity to do some research and dig into this and ask some of these key questions to try to figure out why is it that global health innovation is so hard. You know, there's a lot of money that goes into this, billions and billions of dollars every year. There are a lot of people like us that work on these issues, but we haven't really solved a lot of the problems that are out there. We still have malaria, we still have HIV, we still have tuberculosis, we still can't get kids vaccinated, for goodness sake. Why is it that it's so hard to solve these problems that seem like we could come up with a solution that would get us there? And if it's so hard, where in the process are the innovators getting derailed? Because there's no shortage of folks that want to do this, and it's incredibly important that we keep the enthusiasm up and that all of you continue to work on these problems. They're the most important ones that we can. So what is it in the process that gets you off track? And then what are the solutions that we might be able to come up with so that you can do better? These are the questions that people talk about a lot. You know, when you look to the media and you look to your colleagues and folks who have come before you, you often hear the stories of success. Or you often hear stories about how projects have been successful even though they haven't quite had the impact that we thought they would so far. But you don't hear very often what are the failures. And you don't hear very often what are the challenges. And a lot of that has to do with the environment in which we support this work. As academics, it's difficult to talk about what we do that doesn't work because we don't get a lot of credit for it. As entrepreneurs or as folks running NGOs who are looking for funding, it doesn't do us a whole lot of good to tell our funders, sorry, we made a mistake. It's hard to get that next tranche of money when you do that. There's not an environment in which talking about the bad stuff is rewarded. And that's a shame because it means that we are doomed to repeat it. And we do, over and over again. If you think about water pumps, it's one of my favorite things is to go somewhere in the developing world and try to find all of the water pumps in a village that don't work, that have been installed by different organizations time and time again. There are a number of different things like this that happen, and it's a shame because all of the time and money and effort that went into putting in that water pump could have done something better. And so this work for me has been an effort to maybe not be such a sunny personality on this. And some of you who know me know that I don't have a reputation for being the cheerleader, but have the reputation for looking at something critical and telling you what the problems are. I think that's important to do. I don't think we do that enough because that's how you're going to solve the problem to begin with. And so I'm going to walk through a little bit of the research that we did. You, if you are a hardcore academic, will tell me that this is probably not publishable research. I'm okay with that. That's not what I'm going for. But I will tell you that we are publishing an article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review in the spring that talks a little bit more in depth on this. And there are resources that I'll talk to you about that are available online. They might not be to the rigor that you might want, but hopefully it'll get you started. And I hope this starts a dialogue both today and then beyond. So we're going to talk about these key issues based on research that I did with a colleague of mine, Lynn Dennant, who still works at Stanford with the bioengineering department, where we talked to 25 organizations and a bunch of different entrepreneurs about what their problems were. Now, first, global health is complicated. Health is complicated. When you're trying to come up with a solution that has to do with saving lives, it's complicated. You've got to think about safety, and you've got to think about how the patient-provider-payer situation works. You've got to worry about safety. Healthcare is tough. Healthcare in a geography that isn't where you live is tougher because you don't necessarily understand the market dynamics. You don't necessarily understand the cultural aspects of how people make decisions. And you may or may not understand exactly what it means to have limited resources. Now, I just got off the phone with a friend of mine who lives in Swaziland today and works for the World Bank, and she was lamenting the fact that she still has to remind her colleagues in DC who don't remember that she doesn't get internet all the time. It's just something that we don't think about when we're not in it consistently. And so this all together makes global health a really complicated field to work in. That's not to say it's not something we should do. I actually think that's why we should do it. It's even more fun to work on the hard problems. So the 6 key challenges that we identified trying to put this into a framework are that people run into problems when you are trying to identify and validate the needs. So what is it that is a problem out in the field? What do patients need? And then understanding what are the market and the stakeholder dynamics. How do people make decisions? What are the things that we need to understand about how products get from place to place, and who is making the purchasing decision? Then there's creating your product or service and getting it market ready. As you may or may not know, there's a very big difference between making something that works in your lab and making something that works in the field. It seems a little bit obvious, but it's actually an entire field of study around implementation science and how do you take things from the bench and get them to work at the bedside. And then because a lot of you are going to think about this not as something that is just a nice thing to do that you put out into research, but you really want to sell it, how does that work? What is the business plan around it? What's the business model? And then how does sales and marketing and distribution work? How do you actually get your product to the people that need it? And then because none of this happens without money, who's going to give you that money? How are you going to get it from the beginning? And how are you going to get enough of it to push you through? So we'll talk about all 6 of those things. And then basically at the end, and so I hope you start thinking about this now, I'd like us to talk together about what are the problems you're facing. I'm not sure exactly where folks are in the process of creating products and services in this room, but I imagine that some of you are already coming up against some of these barriers. And I think it might be interesting just to talk about that a little bit amongst ourselves. So that's where we're going. So identifying and validating needs. Play Pumps is one of my favorite NGOs. Does anybody know Play Pumps? Does anybody else like them? No. Yeah, it's a water pump. And I hate to pick on the water pump people, but play pumps are a playground device that a man came up with when he took a trip to South Africa, and he noticed that there was a problem with people getting water, and he realized that there were a lot of children, and he thought, well, if we create a playground area that looks like a merry-go-round that will bring water up, we can get that untapped resource of children to get the water to the community. Which sounds a little bit like slave labor, which is sort of a problem. But what's worse is that he didn't really understand that the problem wasn't that we didn't have the human resources to get water out of the ground. That wasn't what the problem was. So in identifying and validating the need, he just took his perspective on how the world worked and came up with a solution. He might have been right. In this case, Play Pumps has turned out into not a very successful project. You might see lots of photos on the internet where there are children smiling and laughing as they go around the play pump. But from anecdotes I've heard from the field, that only happens when people are visiting. The rest of the time, the kids don't like playing on it, and you end up having women pushing the pump around who are pretty unhappy about it because it's even harder than the manual pump they would have used. And this is just an example to show that when you're coming up with a product, you really need to start with your user. What are the needs of your user? And what are the constraints that they're working under? And it takes a fair bit of time, if you're not that person, to build up the empathy and understand the circumstance so that you're able to really build something that is going to address all of their needs. And it's an ongoing part of this process. At every stage, you have to be thinking about your user. There are a couple of resources that I think are particularly useful that sort of give some training on this. At the D School at Stanford, there's a boot camp bootleg, which you can get online. And then IDEO.org also has a human-centered design toolkit. Both of them are available online that talk about how you can start building up that empathy and understanding how you get into the mind of your user. The next one is sales, marketing, and distribution. So DREV, or Design Revolution, is an NGO that is now based in San Francisco. And they've created a couple of different products, but one that they're most known for right now is called Brilliance. And it is a device to address jaundice with blue light. They came up with a great product. They did all of their user testing and understanding to make sure that they had a product that was going to solve the problem. But what they needed to figure out was how they were going to get their product to the hospitals that they wanted to service. Because they're based in San Francisco and they were addressing a market in India, they decided to work with a wholesaler. And that seemed like a pretty good plan, but the distributor that they worked with had some incentives about selling as many products as they could. And the hospitals that they were going to be able to sell those for at the highest price point weren't necessarily the rural hospitals, weren't necessarily the hospitals where you were having more poor people come who needed this kind of service. So DREV did a really interesting thing, and in their contract with Phoenix, they put in a royalty clause so that Phoenix made more money on every product that they sold to a rural hospital or a community hospital than they did on something that they sold to an urban hospital. So they changed the incentive system by using their contract. And that was just an important thing for them because they were able to understand how the distributor was making their decisions, sort of using that user-centered design approach, not just about your patient, but then about your salesman, to understand how that was going to work. And then making sure that they set up the system so that they were going to get to the results that they wanted. The other thing that I think is particularly important about this, and we run into with a lot of innovators, is that once you have your product, getting it out to market is pretty complicated. And it's necessary to understand what you're good at and what you're not good at. Most people who are creating products, especially technical products, are probably not going to be the right people to sell it. And the organizations may not be the right organization to sell it in another place. And so thinking about who your distributors are, what your sales channels will be, and then contracting in to get that kind of service is really important, if that is the area that you decide to go into. There are other organizations like Maternova, which is a website that's run out of Boston, and they've decided to focus not on creating things, but on being the distributor. So they have their expertise around getting products out to market. Knowing what you should own and what you should build partnerships about is pretty important, particularly as it has to do with sales and distribution. The next is understanding market and stakeholder dynamics. And so this is another group called Diagnostics for the Real World. And DRW's first product was a diagnostic that was for a chlamydia rapid test. And they thought that this was a really good product because they were able to, in one visit, diagnose someone. But they worked in a country that had some cultural and religious norms that made sexual testing for STIs not something that people were going to get behind. And so despite the fact that they had a product that made a lot of sense, for a patient who needed it, there was a group in the middle that was going to make a decision about whether or not they could get it out to the folks that needed it. And they didn't do enough research about understanding those dynamics and the stakeholders who had control. So they ended up having a product that sat on the shelf for quite a long time. This, again, is extending that idea of really understanding your user to understanding all the different users along the chain. The next one is Embrace. Has anybody heard of Embrace? Yeah, it's another one that people get pretty excited about. Full transparency, I'm on the board of advisors for Embrace. And Embrace is, as you can see, it's a little sleeping bag device that addresses low-weight birth babies who have hypothermia. It's a really beautiful device. Embrace is one of these organizations that we talk about because it's been a leader in defining the hybrid model. The hybrid model is bringing together being a nonprofit and a for-profit. And it doesn't bring them together in one organization, but it actually has two organizations sitting next to each other. And the reason that they did this is that Embrace needed to raise funds that were some coming from for-profit entities, so they could get actual investments, and then some that were grants. They found that it's really a challenge to make decisions when you have economic and social impact goals, because it turns out that you can't pick both ever. You pick one each time. And you might be building up so that you're picking, sometimes we pick a social goal, and so we'd maybe do something where we're not going to make as much money because we want to reach more people. And sometimes you say we're going to pick this because we're going to make a profit and that's going to feed in. But at no time can you do both. And so the structure of their organization really mimics this problem. And now they have two organizations, one that is about getting the product out to as many low resource settings as possible, and the other that's about selling as many products as possible. And those two organizations work sometimes at cross purposes. It's really interesting to see how that plays out. Understanding what your business model is, which direction you want to go, or if you want to try to do this dance where you're doing both at the same time, is pretty critical. It might not be critical as you're coming up with your product, but it's something that you need to think about pretty early in the process, especially as you're thinking about where your funding is going to come from. The next one is a group called Adaptair, and they came out of Stanford's D School. And it's just that silicone mask. That mask is attached to a baby's face when they're using CPAP, or continuous positive airway pressure. And it's about creating a better seal so that when air comes in and goes out, the baby's actually filling up the lungs. This device is amazing. It's been used in Bangladesh, and the doctors there are just wowed by it. But it's a device that costs a couple of cents. And there's no one that wants to manufacture it, because there is almost no profit you can make from it. And it's not part of a full solution. It's just a mask that goes along with the CPAP device. It's a device that makes a huge difference in the lives of the babies that get to wear it, but very few are really ever going to get to, because there's no way to make money from it. And there are very few organizations that are willing to put the funds into, from a nonprofit perspective, supporting an organization that's doing something that's just along the fringes and has to work with a whole bunch of other organizations. It's really complicated. So here's a group that came up again with something that matched the patient need, something that the stakeholders were willing to use, but because they couldn't come up with a business model that made sense, their product isn't market ready. There are a couple of resources again here that go through a bit more on some of the biodesign perspectives. Again, both things that are from the biodesign department at Stanford. And then the one that really is the toughest, I think, is securing your adequate funding. And the reason I think this is the hardest is because it's not something that just the innovators need to understand, but it's something that we need to work with our donor and investor communities to make sure that they understand. A lot of you who have talked to successful organizations will hear that the first way that they got money was through a business plan competition. A business plan competition where they maybe got $10,000. And during the time that they used the $10,000 that they got from the business plan competition, they're probably spending 70% of their time trying to figure out where the next $10,000 is going to come from. And maybe there are 2 or 3 different business plan competitions you can go to. And then maybe you get to be an Echoing Green Fellow or a Draper Richards Kaplan Fellow. Maybe you get one of those things that support you for another couple of years with a couple $100,000. But when we're talking about medical devices, the cost to get these things out to market are not $10,000 or $200,000. And it's not over 6 months or 2 years. We're talking about 10-year projects that cost millions of dollars. And really estimating how much it's going to cost for you to get from stage to stage and being honest about that is important from your perspective, but it's tough to do because donors don't really understand it either. Investors don't really understand it either. And so I think we're in a real quandary in terms of securing adequate funding to get people from prototypes to things that work in the field. D-Light is a perfect example of an organization that went through this. They won a number of different business plan competitions, and then they got lucky and they found an investor who was willing to put millions of dollars behind them. But it took a long time, and they're one of very, very few that actually got there. So this is something that is why I think these stories are important to tell and why it's important for us to challenge one another and then challenge the donor and investor community so that we're sure that we're starting to get more access to the resources that we need to get things out into the field for real. So there are 20 to 30 different stories like these that we've put together in this Innovation Insight series. All of them are up online. You can Google it or copy down that long URL. And I think that it's going to be important as you consider where you want to head to try to get as much information about what people have done before you. And the information about what people have done before you that has not worked so that you're able to stand on those folks' shoulders. And then hopefully we can spend a little bit of time today so that some of you can learn from one another in the room and start building up those relationships if they aren't already so that we can stand on one another's shoulders. So my questions for you are, what are your big challenges? And what solutions have you come up with that have been useful? Are there things that you guys want to learn and share about today? And how can we help? And that's it, because really no one wants to listen to anybody talk for a full hour. So it's your turn. Yes, please.
I was waiting for the microphone.
Okay.
When I've looked at, I'm at the School of Public Health, and when I've looked at innovations in public health, what has impressed me is the amount of money and energy, or not money, but energy and effort that has gone into things that if you understand the health and the health systems in developing countries and what are the major causes of disease and how they are treated or diagnosed, that most of these innovations wouldn't make much of a difference, wouldn't have much of a health impact. I would put Embrace in that category. But many others. And it just seems to me that I agree entirely with what you said about, particularly about health impact. And I think if there was a better kind of analysis or kind of by many of these innovations of what exactly, how many DALYs, just like what we heard this morning, then it's going may potentially, under the worst circumstances, may allay. Then we could, you might be, some priorities could be set with the limited resources that are available.
Do you think that the priorities that are set with the MDGs or anything that comes up from WHO, should those be the priorities that we follow?
I am happy to go along with the DALYs, but I'm talking from a health perspective. Mm-hmm. I think that when MDGs bring in a tremendous amount of other the energy and other kinds of education potentially, and what has also impressed me is that there have been a lot of innovative new ways of measuring when things don't look like they're going to make a difference in DALYs. The DALYs doesn't work out well. Then you invent a new way of making your product look like it's going to have an impact. So
I think it's a really interesting perspective, and in large part I agree that it's important to address the biggest problems, and we can measure those with DALYs. I imagine that there are some folks who are inventors in the room who may have just stumbled upon an invention that has to do with something that they really have no idea what the DALY impact is. And one of the big ones that I would put out there that at first we might not have thought was such a good solution from that perspective is the mobile phone. And yet now we're seeing, because of the way that that's being implemented, that there are lots of good implications around DALYs. I think there's a real balance for us to try to reach, and certainly the innovators that are coming up with products need to understand the impact around what is the health change that we're going to make. And I think it might be difficult to give anyone the power to say, this is the list of priorities, and if you're not doing things that fall on this part of the list, your invention isn't worth going down. I think that might stifle a bit of the approach that people take when they're just coming up with new solutions. And I'm not sure who I want to trust to make that list. So I agree in part that it's so important to do that measurement, but I challenge the idea that if we have a list of priorities, that's the way that we should be thinking about innovation, because I think it might stifle a bit of the process. I wonder if any of the innovators in the room or inventors in the room might have a perspective on how you decided what it was that you would create.
Although the people who give the money, in fact, make those decisions.
They do.
So in fact, if you were an innovator, you're going to want to look at some of those things if you want to set it up for getting some kind of funding.
That's a really, really important point. That's an important point. Who's invented something in the room? Sylvia, and you're holding the microphone. How did you decide, what did you invent, and what brought you to invent it?
Is this on? So I invented a handheld magnetic cell sorter. And I kind of, well, so for my master's degree, I created a cell sorter that was based off of an inkjet printer that I modified. But once, towards the end, when I was finishing up that project, I realized that you really don't need the printer or the computer. But I was already trying to finish my master's and move on. So in the transition from moving to my previous school to moving here, that summer I kind of kept toying with the idea of, oh, I can do this, in a handheld way, and it won't require any electricity, and it'll be portable, and it can be made low cost. So I kind of designed it, and then I came here, and I joined Kevin Healy's lab, and he was really supportive about it. And I was able to actually acquire some funding through the Center for Integration of Medicine and Innovative Technology. They had a competition, and I got funding that way, and so now we're working on it.
And what's the health problem that you'll address with it?
So right now we're trying to just address monitoring the progression of HIV to AIDS using CD4 positive lymphocytes. And so we're focusing on that because it's important to know the patient's CD4 positive cell count so that the doctor knows how much therapy to give them. And yeah, it's just something that kind of just developed over time.
Yeah. So what this brings up for me is that there are a group of folks that invent things. And when you were inventing it, I'm imagining you weren't thinking about HIV.
Actually, we started with HIV.
Great.
Actually, it's kind of been the
metaphor.
opposite. We started with HIV, and then slowly we started realizing that, this can apply to other diseases. And
when you were first doing it and you were working on the printer, so back at the master's level,
right.
were you thinking about infectious disease? Did you know the health impact that you wanted it to have specifically when you first started thinking about, wow, this is an interesting way to sort cells?
Right. Yeah. So we didn't take into account dailies or it was further on this, started looking into health statistics and where this could actually have the greatest impact. And over time, that's where I realized that some of the poorest countries in the world have the highest HIV infection rates. So, yeah.
Oftentimes, and maybe you're not the best example for this, but oftentimes you'll have inventors that come up with something because they understand a technology, but they aren't really thinking about the health impacts. Sometimes you have people that do both, but oftentimes you will have folks that work in computer science or work in microfluidics and who are not thinking about the health stuff. And then you have the people who are thinking about the health impacts. And we don't necessarily talk to one another a lot. And I think maybe the best sort of marriage of these two things is when we can create those relationships so that as we who understand the health needs out there can highlight, these are really big needs. Wow, it would be fantastic to have solutions for these. And we who are understanding the technical capabilities of stuff that we can make have conversation so that we can see where those two things marry. And even if that's something that you think you might have done, continuing to have those conversations so that as the technologist, you're sure you're addressing something that's going to have a big impact, both because that's the right thing to do and you're probably going to get more funding. And as a person who's thinking about health impacts, to reach into the technical communities, to be looking for solutions. That's another way that we can sort of think about this community and the broader community and how we can work together to take advantage of both of those areas of inquiry. There's a hand over here.
Yeah, you touched on the importance of knowing what your end user wants or does. And I think that's probably the single most critical problem. But what came up a minute ago was you can only do what funders will fund. And funders often have never been to Africa and don't know less than you do, and you may not know enough about what users want. So how do you address that disconnect? Do developing countries use CD4 as a way to monitor therapy?
Yes, that's standard.
My understanding is they use CD4 as a cutoff for whether or not to initiate therapy.
Actually, the World Health Organization has their guidelines at what stages you have CD4 cell count in ranges, and they define the stages by the CD4 cell count.
Sure.
So
Okay,
you're both
anyway,
right.
That issue aside, how do you address this question of you may or may not have spent enough time to understand that your users really want the innovation that you're trying to develop? Mm-hmm. What if none of the funding organizations have that same understanding and don't appreciate that this is something that will actually be used if you make it?
Well, I think the first part is it's your responsibility to know that that there is not just need but demand. So it's great if you invent something that is the most magical toy, but if nobody's going to use it, it actually doesn't matter all that much. The way to get somebody to use it might be convincing them. That's behavior change, or marketing, or manipulation, which goes back to my earlier career. The same thing is true with funders. It's unfortunate, but it's not uncommon that people come up with ideas that no one thinks are needed already. And part of the way that you get investment, either grants or for-profit investment, is that you have to convince people that what you're doing is going to make a difference and people will buy it or use it, depending on what their metrics are. So as an inventor, you have a responsibility of either yourself being able to do or bringing someone on your team who can convincingly make your case. Because again, if you just hold on to what you're doing in the lab, it's not going to have the impact. And I just think that that's something that we often don't impress upon inventors enough and give the skill building and training and support to make you stand up here and, just as I made Sylvia do, tell me, what did you invent? You know, you did a great job answering that totally on the fly. A lot of other people might have really stumbled over it. And if you can't explain it in a room full of people who understand most of what you're talking about, it's going to be real tough to convince a funder that they should trust you with a bunch of money.
No, just as a follow-up, you mentioned a couple organizations. The D School, every summer, you know, the students actually go to the field identifying problems. I am on a board of a company, a group, a nonprofit organization called IDE. They're a terrific resource. They're in the field, and you know, every time Dr. Jim Patel sends on some of the stuff there. Same thing is done at DREV, is that a lot of people on the ground, resources on the ground, that will really validate, identify the needs, and if the needs are identified, validate that they are real needs and not just wish lists. So those are probably good places to go and check it out.
I would also say that although I believe that the D School has done a good job of starting this, and ID is certainly an amazing organization that allows students and others to come and work with them to really understand what's happening on the ground and then figure out how do you make things on the ground also. 2 weeks is not enough. One trip in the summer is not enough. And if you are really committed to building a product or service that is to serve people who live in the developing world, 99 out of 100 of you need to move and need to be prepared to live there for quite some time. It is, and this is me being sort of the gray unicorn, it is irresponsible for us to think that we can sit in San Francisco and solve the problems of people living in the developing world without really committing ourselves to getting out there and being in it. You won't understand your user enough. You won't understand the distribution system. You won't understand the government system. You won't understand the stakeholders. You won't understand that you don't have internet all the time. You can't. And I take a really hard line on this, and it's probably not particularly popular. But I think if this is something that you're committed to doing, especially as young students and young innovators, I want you to do it. But I want you to do it responsibly, and I think that it's important to be very real about what the commitment is behind it. It is a long, hard job that takes a lot. You're going to give up a lot. And if you are successful, you will change the world. It is totally the perfect payback, but just don't fool yourself about the commitment that you're taking up front.
I have a question regarding the business model, profit and non-for-profit embraced. Can you talk to us a little bit about how did they do that? Because there's no Chinese wall, right? And is it the same branding, different branding? You know, can you share with us the best practices of how to achieve what I call the double bottom line if possible?
I wouldn't say the hybrid is the best practice. I think it is still to be determined what is the best way of doing this. I think a hybrid is a very complicated model of figuring out your business model. And it was a decision made by where they would get funding, and they've run into problems about how they operate. Both organizations standing alone on their own are doing fine. Are they doing the best that they could? Are they optimized? I don't think so. And I think part of why they're not optimized is because they have to work with one another. It is very difficult to optimize an equation where you're balancing the two different things. The economics and the social impact are almost always diametrically opposed. Because if I make a product and I want to make the most money on it, I'm going to charge a lot and I'm going to sell it to rich people, which isn't necessarily what I was trying to do if my social impact was to get to the resource-constrained settings. And so it's another place where I'm pretty direct. You are never able to make that decision and weigh both equally. It is either you're making an economic decision and that comes first in this instance, or you are making a social decision and that comes first in this instance. And you can go back and forth and try to balance, but at no time are you doing both at the same point. Does that make sense? I'm not answering your question totally directly, A, because I don't feel like I'm in the right position to give you more of the detail on Embrace, and B, I don't think that's the best model to talk about around the double bottom line. I think double bottom line in general is a challenging concept. And it's one that, again, donors have sort of pushed us towards, especially the impact investing space. And if you want to make me really mad, we can talk about impact investing. I spent 1 year traveling all over Africa. I didn't have a house anywhere. I worked for the Clinton Foundation and was responsible for pediatric programs everywhere. And then I spent another 9 months living in India. I did not spend enough time to be an innovator that would have had a product. Not at all. Yes, you.
So I guess looking at the bigger system then, and then points of influence on kind of the institutional level, like if as an innovator, as an academic, there's a lot of talk about building up evidence bases and then maybe like showing that this works and this doesn't, and then evaluating those sorts of things, what's the behavior change, what's the nudge as we go through our careers to affect institutions? I mean, because a lot of the talk has been, oh, well, sponsors fund this, so then innovation goes this way. But that innovation isn't only products, it can be services. There's a whole spectrum of things you can do. You need to go out on the ground, and perhaps the organizations funding these things, the way that they evaluate the projects, isn't aligned with the actual end impact or what can work. So I guess as people go through, currently, as we sit here in California, as we go through on the institutional level, have you seen kind of points of entry where people have been really good at translating evidence and science to good stories and policy and procedural changes?
Can you repeat the question for the recording, like summarize?
Can somebody give you a microphone and can you repeat the part of the thing that is the question?
Yeah, sorry. So,
Can you turn it off? There's a little switch.
Okay, so on the institutional level, is there work that needs to be done as people have success in this area of translating what works into promoting maybe sponsors, donors, the people who control some of the economics to adjust some of those? Or is that a part that needs to change, or is that just an acceptance as an entrepreneur, as someone working with global health, that these institutions are going to change much more slowly than any sort of innovation or impact you can have?
I do think there's a need for institutional change. I think there are a couple of foundations that focus on that. I think the Malago Foundation is one that's pretty clear about looking at impact on the ground. I think that academic institutions are not necessarily the place to focus on implementation, because the purpose of an academic institution is to research things and to evaluate things and to disseminate information about things and to educate students. That's most of the mission for an academic institution. To be a practitioner who is implementing is often not rewarded as if you are trying to go up the ranks as a faculty member. It's about publication, and publication isn't necessarily, or even very often, about doing. And in some disciplines, it's actually seen as a detriment if you are a doer rather than an evaluator. And so I think it's very challenging if you are in the academic ranks to balance that portion of your life and being a practitioner. I know some folks who have done a very good job of it, but I think it's challenging. That has not been my path, so I'm not qualified to say any more than just my observations of people that I know. But I know there are some folks, and I'm going to look at Gary, you've been a practitioner and you've gone through the academic faculty ranks and you're a clinician. And it seems to me that you've been balancing that for a long time. I wonder if you have any perspectives on this sort of institutional question.
I think it's, first of all, it's hard to do it at any one point in time. In a long career like I've had, you can have segments of your career where you're doing one more than the other. I do think that there's value in having some skill sets in very different areas because you can leverage those when you encounter a new problem. So that's one advantage. On the other hand, there's certainly power in high specialization because you get very, very good at a particular thing. And if it's very important, that may be the key for success. And I think then there's personal taste. You know, what kind of life do you want to have? Jim talked about that in a very elegant way, I think. But I think if your life wants to be typified by diversity, versatility, that's one thing. If you derive more satisfaction by becoming a real expert in a specific area, that's another thing. And that's the kind of conversation with yourself that Jim was referring to, I think.
I'm sorry, I missed that. Does that start to answer your question? Do other folks have a perspective on this?
Yeah, yeah. About the prioritization of issues, I think, yeah, that is a major problem, and I do feel that dailies or maybe a quantitative metric should be more prioritized. So that it would set up a bingo list, like, you know, number one priority, second priority, or even groups of priorities. This would help in grabbing those investors if there is this metric that does quantify the impact factor of the issues. I think this should be a major pursuit so that it can be translated to the everyday audience. Dailies is I mean, I just learned of it today, but this type of quantifiable impact, I think, would really drive investors to pursue this societal impact change. Because I think if you can provide the product service that causes the impact factor to happen, obviously people are willing to pay to get that impact.
Mm-hmm. So you learned about DALIs today?
Yes.
Can you tell me in one sentence what a DALI is?
No.
Right. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to put you on. I know I do mean to put you on the spot. I'll be honest.
I've heard of it. And yeah.
It's just because DALIs are. I can't tell you in one sentence coherently what a DALI is, and I've used them. DALIs are a construct that is necessary because we don't have another one, but it is cumbersome and challenging. And while I think that it's the best that we've got right now, I think it would also be much more useful to have something that was easier to understand, because we've known about them for a long time, and they have not been the thing that has pushed funders to do something. What pushes a funder to do something is very personal to the funder. And it's personal even at an institutional level, because you have people that are running institutions. And so if we could have, through this research, said, here's how you need to make your pitch to funders, this is the way to get it done, we would have told you. It's just much more complicated than that. Figuring out the way to make those connections is as complicated as calculating a DALY. And it's unfortunate. But on the other hand, it's also fortunate because it means that you have to make these personal connections to do it. And this is not any different than if you were trying to start a company that was making a 3D printer or a camera or a car. It's the same thing. We're doing innovation, and we have the same challenges with a little bit some more challenge because we're talking about doing it in faraway places that people sometimes haven't been to and can't imagine. On the other hand, there's something about capturing the imagination about somewhere that people haven't been and they can't imagine that you don't have when you're trying to just sell a 3D print. Well, maybe not a 3D printer. People get excited about that, but the regular printer. Nobody cares about that anymore. So it's this balance of knowing that you've got a bigger challenge, but you also have the same challenge as pretty much everybody else that lives in Silicon Valley right now. Pat.
I was wondering if you could. I think you turned it off. Sorry. Can you hear me now? I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on your comment about the role of academia in this landscape, because I know that people in different forms of academia have tried to play roles in various parts of the value chain, and that's failed in some cases and succeeded in others. And you were mentioning the sort of difference between the inventors and the implementers downstream. And could you talk a little bit more from the case studies that you were evaluating, what roles academic institutions and researchers and students played that were positive in those relationships versus detrimental in those relationships?
Mm-hmm. So most of the case studies that we looked at were with practitioners and not with academics. So my comments about that will not necessarily be reflected in those pieces. The ones that did come from the academic setting were mostly things that came from student projects, because the intent of this research was to look at within the Stanford community or how to help the Stanford community be able to do better with their innovations. So projects like the things that happen out of the D School, like the things that happen out of a lot of the classes here at Berkeley, I think are can be incredibly positive, but not all of them are positive because of the product. The process is what's the most important thing. Learning how you think about global health innovation is I think, the key deliverable that comes out of those programs. So if Embrace doesn't work, but those 4 co-founders are now committed to coming up with solutions to global health problems, that is a success. It would be great if both the product worked and the students came up with something. That would be even better. But if that's not the case, we've still got to win. The institutional issue, I think, has to do with the match about how you're rewarded, how you are seen as a successful academic. And that is not often about what you do in practice. And to Gary's point, it's about these different things you do at different points in time. I'm working right now with Eric Gooseby, who just left PEPFAR. He was the ambassador to PEPFAR, and he just joined UCSF about a month ago. And we're developing a Center for Implementation Science. And implementation science is a new area that basic scientists would absolutely say is not science. But the problem we're looking at is why things don't work, why the implementation doesn't work. And we want to, in practice, work with governments to come up with solutions to their global health needs, and with academics to research the process by which those things go through so that we can tell those stories. So I think the academics have a role in the evaluation, a role in the observing and telling us what's happening and what's not. I think then there's also the role for inventing. So much invention happens within academic institutions. Sometimes we are able to pull the invention through to implementation, it becomes a product, but at some point, most of the time, it leaves the academic institution and becomes its own entity when that implementation is happening. I think understanding that process will be something that will be interesting that this center may or may not get to do. Although I sometimes sound negative about academic institutions, it's because I focus so much on that health impact and that practitioner thing. And I don't think that we are as honest about the role that academic institutions and students and faculty members and researchers play. I think they're important roles. I just wish we could be more honest about when we need to play better with others. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, when should the red light turn on that we should be talking to someone besides our academic community when we're working on an interesting project?
No. Always. I think it's incredibly important to be, from the very earliest stages, talking to a diverse set of people. And there are people within the environment, within the academic environment, who are not, who are playing by a different set of rules. So it doesn't necessarily mean leaving campus. It just means finding people who have played different roles. I hope that's useful.
Quick comment about DALYs, 30 seconds, because it seems to keep cropping up. This is the way I sort of understand it as a non-public health person. It's basically one useful year of life. That's what it means. So it started with measuring deaths, and then people said, well, how many deaths will you avoid with a certain intervention? Doesn't fully account for the problem, because some people will become disabled and with certain neurological diseases or other diseases. So you have to look at a useful deaths as well as a useful year of life. So that's the quick way of thinking about it, just to try to advance the discussion. There might be a more precise definition, but that's how I've always thought about it. How many useful years of life do you save with your intervention?
I wish a DALY was as easy to understand as a dollar.
You talked a lot about the need to understand, to live in developing countries to kind of understand the social issues. But, I mean, there are people who are experts in those things, like social scientists. And do you think that it would be better to keep the specialization of having, inventors be inventors, and then when you want to adapt a solution to the developing world, more so maybe consult with people who are experts in certain cultures and societies to overcome some of those issues?
If you want... What does spaghetti taste like?
Bland carbohydrates.
Interesting. Would you like to understand how spaghetti tastes because you've tasted it, or because your neighbor told you what it tasted like?
Yeah, I see. Obviously, it is better to experience it yourself.
There's just something about, there are things that you can't transmit fully, because we are amazing beings who take in information so many different ways. And you are a unique, amazing being who takes in information in so many different ways. And as an inventor, you will see things differently. I don't think it's not useful to read or consult with, but I don't think it's a replacement. And the experience that you gain by interacting in that way will change not only how you think of your particular invention and how that may or may not be useful, but it will change the way that you think about almost everything. And there's almost no case that I've run into anyone who's had that experience that it's been in a negative way, even if it is spending 2 weeks uncomfortably on a toilet in India.
So this is, like you said, healthcare is difficult. Global healthcare is, order of a magnitude more difficult. Have you conceived the idea of collaborative institutions where you bring the best of both worlds? You spend time there. There are institutions in India, who are also trying to address the problem. They probably understand. So for instance, like the D school here at Stanford, I could clearly see equivalent school at Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay, their program, equivalent program. So is that a part of your charter to bring together like-minded, similar organizations so that you create to address global problems, create global teams?
There are lots of groups that do that. I think it's a good direction to go down. I think my charter is to highlight that I think this is an issue and try to get to as many people as I can to let's talk about what the problems are. Because as much as I think those institutional relationships can be good, I think, again, it's about these individual relationships. And the strongest part of that is that I meet inventors or I meet clinicians in other places, and then I have a long-term relationship with them so that they can help me answer whatever is the question I have today or tomorrow or the next time around. And then I build those networks out. So the other reason that going is important is because of the people that you meet along the way. And it's not just the 2 weeks that you spend or however long you spend, but it's the access you then have to people who can give you real-time information and feedback about what you're doing. And then the richness that adds to the way that you think about the world. So that's a way to institutionalize the idea of the collaboration. I don't know that that's always the best thing. I don't know we always need more institutions. But I think the spirit of what you're talking about is particularly important. I'm realizing that we're pretty close to out of time. So I guess I'll just thank you all for not only listening, but then listening to me pick on you a little bit, tell you the things that really make me angry. When I got into this job, into this whole space, it was because I talked to a good friend, and when I was searching for what I should do, she said, pick something that makes you mad. Because for me, when I get angry about things, I get really active. It's just the trigger for me. I would encourage all of you to figure out what is that thing for you that's the trigger, and then find something that makes you want to do it. Because the richness of all of this work is that you're making a difference. And if you make a difference about something that you care about, it almost doesn't matter what you do, or if you listen to me about what I think is important, because you're the one that has to answer yourself at the end. So good luck, and congratulations on being part of this unique community.